about the umbrella of addiction. I've been around the addiction field since the late 70s, and when I went into the field, there was very little literature. I mean, there was just not a lot of research for any addiction. But anyway, I had the opportunity to help start a drug alcohol program in Abilene, even got to name it. And so, anyway, it's still near and dear to my heart. It's one of the best nonprofit treatment centers for drugs and alcohol, I believe, in the country. So, anyway, while I was there at the Serenity House, I noticed that, and we treated mostly men. Every once in a while, we'd have a woman. But back then, even as late as the 70s, women wasn't given really much permission to go to treatment. And so consequently, we treated mostly men. And I started noticing that they would come in, get clean and sober. Sometimes we'd send them to a halfway house. Sometimes they'd go right back home. And then it wouldn't be long till they would be back with us in detox, maybe a month, 6 months, maybe a year, that they would. There's Holly. Good morning, Holly. So, anyway, I noticed that the relapse rate was pretty high. And then I'm noticing that I was very active in I'd go to open AA meetings in Al-Anon. I was very active in the recovering community in Abilene. And so then I started noticing that people were switching addictions. Like we'd get somebody in that hadn't worked for years, and all of a sudden, he would get clean and sober, but then he would get into what we call today work addiction. And what would happen a lot of times in the work addiction, he was too busy. I mean, he had to make a living for his family, he had to make up for lost time of being in treatment. That was what he would say. And so he quit going to meetings, and pretty soon, he was working. That would be all that he was doing. His alcoholism turned to work addiction. And, then we'd see him back in detox. So anyway, it was like a revolving door. And what I noticed is that they would switch addictions, not all of them, but we would have people, guys and gals coming in that maybe were within a normal weight range, or maybe they were thin from the use and abuse of drugs and alcohol. And I mean, give them 6 months sobriety and they'd put on 100 pounds. So I just started noticing this, and that was back in late 70s, early 80s. And somehow, I was standing at the board one day. Most of what I present, I have learned through going to workshops or reading. I read everything I can get my hands on. A lot of it, some of it comes to me directly from God. He speaks to me. But anyway, one day I was up at the board, and I drew an umbrella, and I started putting on the different addictions on the umbrella. And I don't know, to this day, I don't know where I came up with the umbrella. Now, keep in mind, I was so ill while I was doing all of this and having these insights. I was dying one day at a time from a severe eating disorder. I had lost lots of weight, and then I had found bulimia, and so it was the bulimia that was really killing me. And I didn't know that there was hope or places for folks like me to go. I had no idea that there's treatment for people like me. So I was getting very, very sick. I was seeing a doctor, an internist. My liver was shutting down. My colon was about to fall out of my body because I was severe bulimic. And I wouldn't tell anyone. Now, my daughters, what I did is massive amounts of laxatives. And my two teenage daughters joined me in that. They would take my diet pills. And this I mean, this went on, and I never said anything. I would just tell them, stay out of my room, stay out of my stuff, and they knew what I was talking about. So what I'm saying is I was getting very ill. So I had come up with the umbrella, and on that umbrella, I started writing what I saw happening with clients that we had treated, and then myself, how I had substituted one addiction for another and another and another. And so that's what I had, the umbrella with the different addictions on them. Not all of them that we have today, we have added addictions on that umbrella. So I got very ill, and y'all know the story that I wound up in AA, in a treatment center for eating disorders. And while I was there, what happens when you go into treatment, they don't let you use. They put me on a very, very strict 1,000 calorie a day plan, which is way too little, but anyway, that's another story. And then I came off those laxatives. And I was, excuse my language, but I was batshit crazy. I was crazy. And I wanted anything to make myself feel better. I would have done anything. And so while I was out there, I think I've told y'all this story. I started stealing lemons. They put out lemons for tea and I'd slip in there during the break while they were getting the stuff ready for lunch. And before the end of the week, the doctors were complaining that they wasn't putting out lemon for tea because I was stealing all the lemons. I'd get the sweet and low, go in the bathroom, eat all of that, eat the rind, all of that. Because what was happening with me is the pain of all of my history was coming up. The pain, and it was killing me. I did not know what to do with the pain. Now, I was there for treatment for an eating disorder. Now, folks, this is early on, before they were just coming out in the 80s. Different treatment centers were talking about trauma, and the 2 or 3 of the big treatment centers were talking about survivors, and so the pain came up big time. Memories of some abuse came up big time, and I wound up going to Florida after spending 30 days in treatment in LA. I came back, stayed a year, went crazy, and then because I didn't know what it was, and then I went to Florida for 30 days for trauma. And then I'd go to a 5-day, a 6-day, 8-day. I did that for the next 20 years or so. I declare myself well today. I no longer go to treatment. I don't go to workshops. I do workshops, but I will tell you, if the pain ever came back, you would not see me on this screen. You would have to come and see me in a treatment center, because I'm not going to mess around. If I have other issues to come up, you bet. I want to get help, and I want to get it quick, because the pain of living is too harsh. So what I came up with, and y'all have, I don't know if you can probably see this, but the umbrella of addiction has the addictions on the umbrella, and these addictions are food. Now, not all food is addictive, and not everyone's addicted to food. Those of us that are, we are addicted. Like I was a volume eater. It took a lot of food to ease the pain. And then I was also a sugar addict and a carb addict. So people who have problems with food, it's not just, it's not as easy to diagnose or a clear-cut diagnosis like it is with drugs and alcohol. So there's food, substance. For some people, there's alcohol, there's drugs, there's caffeine. Now, caffeine is, a cup or 2 of caffeine is good for most people. But what I'm talking about, we would get anorexics in that were drinking upwards to 20, 30, 40, up to 100 cups of caffeine a day, because they serve as a diuretic for a lot of people. And I was already doing that, and I would have told you before I went to treatment that I didn't drink much coffee. Well, I got out there and got to inventorying it, and I stayed up. I didn't sleep very much toward the end before I went to treatment. So I would be, on a good day, would drink 3 or 4 pots of coffee, but it would be stretched out in a 20-hour period or so. So caffeine can be addictive. Sugar can be addictive to some people, not all people, but if you have that sensitivity, all that tells you you might not want to eat sugar. And how you can tell if you can need to maybe look at your sugar intake is if you have to have it. That's the way with any addiction. If you can take it or leave it. Like if you go to a wedding and eat one of those little bitty pieces of cake that they give you, they just give you a bite, And you see normies, you can always tell the normies because they'll take a bite or two of that cake and they'll say, "Ooh, this is so rich. It's just too sweet." And then they'll put it down because they're there for the conversation. They're there for the bride and groom. They're not there for the cake. And then for those of us with eating disorders in the past, I would not eat a piece of cake at the wedding because, I'd weigh 270, 280, 290 pounds, 287. And so I didn't want any attention drawn to me. I didn't want them to say, "Look at that fat woman eating that little bitty piece of cake," like it was all about me, But on the way home, I'd buy me a cake. I'd stop at the bakery and buy me a cake. And I would hide it from my kids. And I would stay up all night and eat that cake. Because once you start eating a cake and you eat a piece, then another piece, and pretty soon you've eaten half. And if you put it out, people want to know what happened to the first half. So you just have to go ahead and eat it all. That's how my addiction worked. So sugar was a big deal for me. I want to tell you, and I'll tell anyone this, I'm coming up on 40 years of recovery. September the 19th is my recovery date. 40 years. And if you stay in recovery for a long period of time, if you stay in recovery, God wants to restore us to wellness. You will be restored to wellness. I don't sit around and think about food. I eat 2 meals a day, then I'll eat a snack at night. But my life is not about food. But my whole life was about food, how I could get it, how I could hide it, how much I could eat without getting caught, and then always fear of the weight gain, which would come. And then nicotine. Nicotine is it's very much an addiction, and any form of drugs, and that includes prescription drugs. So that's your substance. And then in the 80s, we came up with, we were seeing people in recovery, like the people I was treating at the Serenity House, and they would get into recovery, and then they would switch off an addiction. And the primary one that alcoholics do is work addiction, because they say things like, "Well, I haven't worked for a while, I need to make my family a living," and they'll quit going to meetings and that type of thing and can get into work addiction. And then there's sex and love addiction. And then there's porn addiction. And porn addiction is run, I've worked with people, I have some private clients, and I work with people that, the porn is very hard to address. It's hard to give up. It's so accessible. You can get away with it. No one knows. And it's, you hide it from yourself or try to. And then if you have a spouse, somebody's going to find out. Porn is one of the biggest addictions today. And it goes all the way down into children, as young as 8, 9, 10 years of age. They are smart parents. You don't have enough lockdown things to put on your computer that can keep these kids away from that porn. So it's a big around teens and people in general. Porn's a big deal. Gambling is still the granddaddy of them all. That's the number one addiction. That's, really, I don't know that it's the number one, but it is I've treated many compulsive overeaters that live in counties close enough where they can cross the state line or something and go to a casino, and they'll sit there being morbidly obese. What a place to go, because you can eat all you want. They bring you drinks, and you sit there and you gamble and you gamble and you gamble. And I haven't treated as many as I used to, but that one combination, gambling, and it's a lot of times it's housewives or it is retired people. A lot of these women will go by themselves because they don't want to go with others, because they are into the food as they are into the gambling. So media addiction, shopping addiction, internet, social media, self-harm, any form of entertainment that you get obsessed with, and then codependency. Codependency can be like a process addiction behavior, and then dating, spending. So these are the outlets that we have that we can use to ease the pain of living. We've got big choices here. But if you want to be in recovery, if you really want to be in recovery, like I said, when I went to the treatment center, I had an idea of this umbrella, but I didn't know what it was covering up until I got clean and sober around the food, and that pain started coming up. It's what we call the core pain. And the core pain, many times, majority of the time, will have come in some form of childhood trauma. When I went to treatment, I'd never heard the word trauma that I believe. I don't know that I'd ever even heard it. There wasn't any talk about childhood problems. But I heard a little bit there. I got a little bit of idea of what was underneath that umbrella that I had drawn on the board at the treatment center. And so when I came back from treatment, and I had already given up the food, and I couldn't use food to ease the pain of living, I'll tell you, the pain, that core pain, started coming up from the trauma, from the childhood trauma, and from the codependency. And so, a year later, I got to buy me another ticket to treatment down in Florida for that core pain. So I'm saying all of this to say why we use a substance or an addiction is to ease the pain of living. Now, not everyone who overeats or who has one too many drinks at a party or whatever, not everyone is an addict. Only those of us who have that brain chemistry does it work for. Normies will, maybe go and binge on buy a package of Oreo cookies and maybe eat half of one of those little, those rolls. Well, that's nothing. That is nothing to a compulsive overeater. You're a penny waste if you can't eat that whole bag of Oreos in one sitting, And that's what, we want volume, we want lots, because it takes a lot of whatever we use to ease that core pain. So what we've seen there's my friend Beth. I see her name, but I haven't seen her face. So what we have, through my own recovery from trauma, through being trained by one of the best, and that's Pia Melody. We lost Pia a little over a month ago, but I did her first training. And then when you did Pia's training, it wasn't anybody's 5 days. We went every weekend to Dallas for 12 weeks. We'd have to kind of piecemeal some of the weekends, anyway, it was a 12-week and it was a lot. And I'm grateful that I got to sit at Pia's feet and learn about trauma, but not only learn about trauma, but how to help people with trauma. And what we did a lot in that training was we practiced on each other. And then the pain, my pain, that core pain of my childhood came up. So, I mean, it was choking me to death. And I knew I had to do something else. And the something else was to go work with Pia. So I went out, flight out to LA and went to, she did it at a treatment center in Arizona, but she was doing one, a 5-day up in the Carmel Mountains. Why not go there when you can? So anyway, I went up there and worked with Pia. And then I did that twice, because when you have a lot of abuse, it takes a long time to peel those layers off. I tell people, for me, for the trauma, that core pain, it took 12 years. Now, I don't mean I worked on it every day or every week, or I didn't sit in a therapist's office all the time. I didn't. I had a family to take care of. I worked. By that time, I had a business. And so I didn't work on it every minute. But what I would do is I would go, and this is why we encourage people to come do an intensive. Leave your crap in Buffalo Gap, come and do an intensive with us. And what we work on is that core pain. And I'll tell you, the core pain doesn't always come from parents. It doesn't. Anytime a child has access to an adult, and an adult has access to a child, there is an opportunity for abuse. And that those people that have access to a child can be babysitters. And there's good people in these fields. So don't hear me say all babysitters are all. It's not. But anyone that has access to a child. And it doesn't take a lot in a day in the life of the child for trauma to go to the heart of that child, and they can pick that trauma up and carry it the rest of their life until they find some help. And it can take them down many, many, many bad roads. When you have unresolved trauma, it doesn't really take you to the high road. It is that core pain that's so it's so deep down inside that it can rule and control everything in your life. I noticed it's fresh on my mind right now because I'm looking at my history one more time. My 3 daughters and I are writing a book together. And our friend Anne Lamont is helping us, and she's teaching us. I've written a book before, but this is different. So she's teaching us, how to write and start with the bad, awful, and wrong. And I keep saying, I hope this doesn't turn out to be a Mama Dearest book, but the first part of it probably will if the kids tell the truth, because I wasn't, a shining example as a mother of those early years because I was so sick. I brought my trauma into my home and spewed it out on the people that I love the most, and that's my children. But if you don't deal with the trauma, it's going to find a way to come up and get out in some area of your life. And the trauma, it doesn't have to be huge trauma. Now, we treat people that have had, lots of trauma, and we have had people that have had an incident or two. It doesn't matter. Do not discount whatever has happened to you. Do not. Because a day in the life of a child is much different than a day in the life of an adult. And if you get a child that is, and most children are sensitive, but you get a real sensitive little child and something happens to that child, it goes straight to their heart, and they carry it unless there's some form of intervention until they can get help, because that trauma will start manifesting itself in behavior. And once it manifests itself in behavior, if they're prone to be addicts, they'll go to find something to relieve that. I'm going to give you a little story, and the man, this is one of the best stories that I could give about trauma for a child, because we always think it has to be huge trauma for it to affect a child. It doesn't, not necessarily. There are people that have been children that have been traumatized in horrendous ways, but it doesn't always have to be something huge. And I'm going to tell you about my friend Gary. Gary's no longer with us. He passed away many years ago, but Gary lived on the streets of Abilene, Texas. He had really never had a home. He was a bad old alcoholic. He'd scrounge around and steal enough money to buy him enough booze to, feed the habit, to ease the pain for a day or two. And then the police would get him and they would put him in jail. And then they'd bring him to us to detox him. And we had detoxed him over 36 times. And the board of directors came to me one day and they said, we're not going to detox him anymore, because what Gary would do, he'd come in and dry out. He would stay with us a week because he'd be so bad, and we'd keep him about a week. It was a state-supported institution, and so it was a free bed for him. So he would stay there, get detox, and go back out. And it was that revolving door. So the board said, you're going to have, because we had Gary down in detox that day. And so it was my job to tell him, this is it. There's no more detox for Gary. So because what would happen, we had a program, a 28-day program, and he wouldn't go into the program. He just wanted to be detoxed so he could get back out and drink. So I told Gary, I said, the board's not going to let you come back. And you're going to die on the streets of Abilene, alone and lonely. And what would keep you from staying here and doing the 28-day program? I mean, you don't have a family, you don't have a car, you don't have a house, you don't have a dog, you have nothing. What would keep you from going into treatment for 28 days? And he dropped his head and he said, I'll walk by and look in that classroom, and I see those guys in there with that book, that blue book. It's called the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. He said, I see those guys in there with that blue book, and they're reading, and then they've got pads and pens and they're writing. And he said, I can't read or write. He said, that's why I don't do the program. I said, that does not matter. If you will agree to stay for treatment, we will help you. And so I happen to have, honest to goodness, I had a rocket scientist from Houston. Their treatment centers were far and few between then. So anyway, and he didn't want to go in his area. Anyway, so I had a rocket scientist, smart, brilliant man in every way except his drinking. So he was smart. And I had another man that was very shy, and he didn't reach out to people much. So anyway, I went to those two guys and I told them my dilemma about Gary. And I said, he can't read or write. Can y'all help him? Well, the rocket scientist just picked right up on that. And he said, yeah, we can read, and then we'll show him how to mark his. Anyway, they had him covered. And so I took Gary in there and introduced the three, and he stayed. He stayed. And, 2-3 weeks later, probably a couple of weeks later, I was walking down, and we had this big hall thing where they had tables set up, and it was their study hall, and they were doing their homework. And I was walking up and down, talking to the guys, and I walked by their table, and Gary was sitting there with a legal pad, a pen in his hand, and a big book open, and he was reading, slow, but he was reading and writing. I said, Gary, you told me you couldn't read or write. And he dropped his head and he said, well, I can read and write at a third grade level. I said, well, tell me what happened in the third grade. He said, well, I quit school in the third grade. I said, tell me about it. And I had already knew his history because I'd already done his psychosocial. I knew a lot about it from what he told me. He grew up in a very dysfunctional alcoholic home, a lot of kids, a little bit of food, no supervision. He had just a few clothes, and what he had were dirty. But he went to school. He loved school. He'd take himself to school every day. And he particularly loved this third grade teacher. Anyone that's listening to this, if you have access to children, hope you'll listen to this, because children are vulnerable. They have soft little hearts. Please be aware of that when you're dealing with children. So Gary loved that third grade teacher. Idolized her. And so one day she had library books there. I took him to the library and they got to pick out a library book. And he was so proud of that. He put it down in his clothes so his siblings wouldn't get it, or they would get it dirty. And so what he was supposed to do, they were supposed to do, is read the book and then write a book report. And she taught him how to write a book report. And they had a week to get that assignment done. And he worked diligently on that assignment so he could please his third grade teacher. So they got there to the day that they were going to read their book reports, and she called for a volunteer. Well, Gary shot his hand up because he was so anxious to please his teacher. And so he got up there and he turned around and he looked. There was probably 30 kids in that small classroom. And he looked out there, and like most of us, we, can speak when we're sitting down, but put us up in front of a crowd. Nevertheless, what happened, he looked at all those eyeballs looking back at him, and he got scared. He got so scared that he had prepared his book report, and his little hand was shaking, and he told me all this. Anyway, he had his paper, and he looked down, and he started stuttering. Now, he had never stuttered in his life. He normally didn't stutter. He was so fearful that he started stammering and stuttering. Now, this is his memory, and I want to cut the teacher some slack. I do not think any teacher would intentionally do something like this. But what she did, it wasn't the kids that laughed at him. It was his beloved teacher. She started laughing at him. And that went to his heart. He left that classroom that afternoon, and he never went back to school again, and never could read or write until he came to the Serenity House and he picked up that writing skill. And so Gary had never held a job. He lived on the streets. He panhandled and went from state to state wherever it was warm, the warmest state, that's where he'd wind up. He'd ride trains, he'd hitchhike, he'd do whatever. So Gary had to get a job. And we did something that we didn't do with other people. Gary was our prize. I thought the board had to let us keep him longer, and so we wound up keeping Gary there at the Serenity House a long time, but he had to get a job. I'm going to hurry this along. Our mall here in Abilene was just opening, and it's worn out now, but anyway, it was a nice mall. It still is, but it's been years and years ago, and they were just hiring people, and they were hiring maintenance people. So I took Gary up there, and he applied for the job, and they called the Serenity House, and he got a job working on the maintenance crew. Well, he didn't know how to hold a broom. He didn't know how to sweep. So we taught him how to sweep, how to mop, how to dust. And so he went to work at the mall here. When Gary passed away, he was head of that maintenance crew at the he was everywhere around that mall. People loved Gary. he found himself. Anyway, that's a tender story, and I almost cry every time I tell it. But the reason I told it is that pain, that core pain, it doesn't have to be. Yes, he was, I'm sure, was abused in his home, but the pain that got to his core, got to the heart of that child, was the reaction that his teacher gave, and that was he felt laughed at. So when I hear people tell me when they come into the intensive or they're thinking about doing an intensive, they'll say things like, well, I haven't had any trauma. I mean, I came from a perfect family. And I just want to say, yeah, and I want to see that perfect family. And so we get them in, and it can be something. It doesn't have to be anything great, big. The trauma, we do treat people that have great big trauma experiences, but it can be something like Gary's, something that went to his core and made him think that he was not worth anything. That's what I'm talking about with this trauma. And trauma must be addressed, because if it's not, Gary could not stay sober, because every time he would sober up, the pain would come back. And this was a grown man. But the pain, it wasn't so much the pain of his parents, it was that teacher, that beloved teacher. And this was before I was ever, God really has given me some insight to things, but this was way before I'd ever had any training in how to do psychodrama or anything. But we did a play act, and I was his teacher, and I thought one point he was going to hit me, and then he just hugged on me and cried. So I'm saying this to say trauma is trauma, and it is the trauma that if you have the brain chemistry of an addict, if you start reaching out to something that will ease the pain of that trauma, you too will become an addict. You will get in trouble with the addiction. And like I said, process addiction, behavior addiction is big in today's time. Work addiction affects so many people. And then the internet, there's so much stuff in the porn. Anyway, but it starts with that unresolved conflict of the past, the unresolved trauma. Your trauma might look entirely different than Gary's, entirely different from mine. Don't judge your trauma up against someone else's. If you've got any pain that is unresolved, I would beg you to get some help, because if you don't, if you have the brain chemistry of an addict, you will find something to ease that pain. And that can be, like I said, food, alcohol, drugs, prescription drugs, street drugs, you name it, work addiction, love addiction. And when I came back from treatment, I'll tell you, I got back from treatment, and I couldn't even drive the first few days. I was like a deer on wobbly legs, a little new fawn. I couldn't drive myself, but the minute I got to where I could drive, where I wanted to go was the mall. I wanted to go to the mall. I couldn't eat because I was committed to treating my eating disorder. So I knew the food was off of the table as far as using food to ease the pain. But what I went for was shopping, and like that, I became a shopping addict. And in that 1 year, I ran up about a $20,000 credit card bill. And my husband, bless his heart, he just loved me. He'd have done anything. He said, don't worry, I'll pay it off. I said, no, you are not going to pay that off. I made the bill. I need to pay it off. I knew that I had switched addictions. So we can switch from one to the other, anything to ease that pain of living. And so And what the pain of living is that it starts with that core pain of childhood. And like I said, don't discount your pain. Do not, if you've had any form of childhood abuse, neglect, or abandonment, I'll tell you the highest form of childhood abuse is neglect and abandonment. Kids can live in $1 million homes and be neglected by their parents that are not at home but have hired a nanny to take care of them. So that's what I have, and I keep reinforcing. We must do the work. If you want to get well, you must do the work, and you can't find anything that is going to ease that pain. You can get a little relief for a short period of time, but until you really get into the trauma and do the hard work around it, you will, if you're an addict, if you're an alcoholic or drug addict, I mean, it's dangerous to not treat the core pain because what it will do in a food addict, it will take you back to your substance every single solitary time, because the disease of addiction is twofold. It is a physical, absolutely has a physical component. Your brain is different from that of a normie. Our mind is. Maybe yours isn't. If you're any sort of an addict, your brain is skewed. It is not like a normie's. I hate to tell you, you're not normal. Join the rest of us that are not normal. We process information different. Anyway, we have an addict brain and an addiction brain. And so if you have that, the way you can tell is look back at your history. Go back 3 generations. Is there any alcoholism there? Is there any drug addiction? How many people have died in your family of addiction? You can be clean as a whistle and still be carrying the addiction gene. And it can come out in a lot of different ways. I just heard on a famous minister talk a while ago. I mean, it was on some kind of talk show. I was getting dressed. It was on my phone. And he was very famous. I'm not going to give you his name, but he was crying. He was being interviewed about childhood trauma, and he had never addressed it, and he passed that on to his children. And until he got to a treatment center for a family week for one of his children that was at a drug alcohol treatment center, he never had touched on the trauma of his past. And so anyway, it can happen, and until you treat the core pain, if you have that, if you're prone to be an addict, you can find anything to ease the pain, but it will not ease it completely. It keeps popping up. So that's what I have. I've got me some people on here that know what I'm talking about. They've been down the road of addiction. Everyone on here is in their own lane of recovery. And so who wants to start? Who would like to share first?